Welcome everyone to episode 4 of The Graded Escape. I'm Kelley.
And I'm Anna. And this is our first episode of a 4-part series that's titled The Heart and Science of Reading. So our first episode is on the 5 pillars of reading instruction.
Yeah, so the 5 pillars of reading instruction are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension.
So one thing that we definitely hear a lot as former educators, I think, in the realm of homeschooling is some of the hottest topics, which are how do you teach your kid to read? I think that that's one of the scariest things for a lot of parents. And I would say even in the classroom that was usually like the ticket item when parents would come in for a conference, or like before the year started, it was like, I want my kid to read. I'm so anxious about, their reading skills or levels, or are they behind or whatever. Reading was always kind of like a very hot topic for a lot of elementary level kids.
Yeah.
So we thought that would be, worth sharing with you, kind of in this 4-part mini series, some of the most important aspects to not only teaching reading, but how to support you as homeschooling parents or teachers in reading instruction. Ways to support students, and give you some more information kind of on the academic level when it comes to teaching reading. So like we said, the very first episode, this one is on the 5 pillars of reading instruction, and Kelley outlined what they are. So the first one we're going to dive into is the phonemic awareness, which, if you're not sure what that means, it is hearing the sounds in words. So believe it or not, when you're teaching reading, you're not starting with whole word instruction, you're starting with the sounds. And oftentimes that looks like using not even the actual letters, right? I mean, you have a good method that was it your Pinwheels program?
Yeah, Pinwheels program I really like. So I think this is a big one that it sort of gets skipped if you're not a teacher. You think like, okay, I'm going to teach my kid to read. We're going to bust out the letters.
Letters, yeah. You jump right to letters.
What sound does this make? What sound does this make?
Yeah.
So much. And I can remember one of the things from my undergrad in special education and in elementary education was this idea of, phonemic awareness and playing with words and the sounds of words, sounds of letters, but not attached to a letter. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, Pinwheels has this really nice, they call them sound blocks. And so they're color-coded blocks or tiles, really. And so, you tell the kid to, spell or to say the sounds in the word cat, and each color has to represent a different sound. So you're doing all of this like they pull at, but it's all without the letters. So really they're focusing on just the sounds as opposed to, like I said, we'll get to that in a second, tying it to a specific letter. What does that letter look like? How do I form that letter? What's that letter name? So this is one I think that's pretty misunderstood, and it's probably the one that is, again, it's a pillar of learning to read, is this idea of phonemic awareness.
The ability for kids to hear and identify those sounds and manipulate those sounds in spoken words. So using that example of cat, do they understand that it has 3 distinct separate sounds, the k, the a, the t, and they don't need to connect it, right, to letters just yet. Right. It's just like, can you identify how many sounds you're hearing? And I agree. I think it might get skipped if you were not have the education background, because a lot of people think starting to read, you jump right to letters, and there's nothing wrong with teaching your kids letters and everything like that, but the sounds, having them be able to identify sounds, start to playing around with rhyming words, like that cat sound. Well, if you get rid of that first k, make another sound, buh, now it's a at bat sound, and it's got 3 separate sounds, but it's a rhyming word. It's it sounds similar, and starting to play with that kind of language all before you ever get into too heavy instruction with actual letters. It's all listening. And there's lots of fun ways that you can do this. Rhymings is one of my favorite things. The sing songs, like sing-along songs, riddles, things like that. Just any time that your music incorporated into phonemic awareness is often really fun. That's why I say songs. But spending time with that, and that you're doing amazing work. I think sometimes homeschooling parents that don't have the education background think that it's not, not necessary or whatever. Right. And, I've definitely seen kids learn to read that don't spend a lot of time on phonemic awareness, but it gives them a much stronger foundation going into the next piece. We're jumping into phonics. And sometimes, actually, I've seen a lot of programs that have phonemic awareness and phonics, intertwined, even though they're very different things. And so they kind of go back and forth. I personally think it's better to spend more time doing phonemic awareness first and then moving into phonics versus, doing it in tandem,
It
but
gets
together.
confusing, I
Yeah,
think.
like, you know, yeah. Because if once you start integrating the letters, they want to say the letters. Like if they hear cat, they want to say, what's a C-A-T? They don't want to just say how many sounds they're hearing yet. So, or they don't want to make the letter sound. They want to say what the letter is.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think it's a good thing to do first.
Yeah.
So
Another one that we do is called head, shoulders, head. I think it's just called head, shoulders. But it incorporates, you know, your kinesthetic learner. So you give them a word, even if, I mean, it can be a longer, you know, word with like a blend or something, like, you know, like splat. Like that's a pretty complex blend, but it's at, and they touch each part of their body, because it incorporates that movement and the sounds, but it's all like we talked about, it's all just the sounds. We did a pretty heavy dose of this in kindergarten as like our little warm-up before we started, but I had like a resource from, I think, either Teachers Pay Teachers or you know, the Measured Mom or something like that, and it was just a phonemic awareness binder, and it just had all these activities. And again, it was, you know, manipulating beginning phonemes, ending phonemes, switching out the vowel, you know, say the word, you know, hit. Okay, now say it without the, and they should say it. It's all of that, like playing with sounds and getting them really fluent. So then when you go to do the next part with the letters, they're really fluent at all of the sounds, and now they're focusing more on, you know, the letters and the names and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And another segue kind of into the next one, which is phonics, is you'll hear this a lot as syllables, you know, being able for a child to clap out syllables, and that kind of, after they've got some phonemic awareness where, right, they're playing around with how many sounds does a word make, then they start to see how many syllables does that sound or does that word make. So, you know, cat has 3 sounds. When you say cat, it's just 1 syllable. And so even that is sometimes, you know, I think it's important to introduce that again before you get into the letters, because they're, again, is breaking up the word, the sounds that they're hearing in the word, and how many times they have to, you know, move their mouth to say the sound or the word, or they clap it out, or lots of different methods to do that too. But really playing around as much as you can, play around with the sounds that words make before going into the actual, you know, instruction of using the letters, I think is super beneficial. So
I know about syllables. A funny little anecdote. So Pinwheels has this part, when they're working on syllables, they had us make these little like bowls with characters on them, and they called them silly bowls.
Oh, cute!
Okay, but I didn't pick up on that right at all. That it was like silly bowls are for syllables. Like it took me, and then finally I was like, oh wow, that's really clever. But what they do is they build these. You make these little bowls, and then you drop in like a little, you know, counter or bean or something for each syllable that you hear. So, you know, if it's like, I don't know, backpack is the best example that I could be like, back. Pack. Okay, how many? 2. We've done like hopscotch, jumping.
I was going to say that's a really great one for those ones that need to move, you know,
Yes.
like elephant, you're jumping elephant. Every time, you know, you jump around and see how many you need to do. And, you know, your learner doesn't have to be reading anything or even know their letters yet to be doing this, because they can hear the sounds and count them. And even if you're doing a more structured sort of like sit down, almost like a worksheet, they still don't need to know their letters, because a lot of syllable worksheets will have like a picture, you know, of like a chipmunk, and then they'll have like numbers, you know, 1, 2, or 3, and they're circling, if they know the numbers, they're circling, you know, how many syllables they're hearing. So again, still not needing to know the letters. So
Right.
So
okay.
So
we'll move on.
phonemic awareness, number one in the 5 pillars.
Yeah. So we'll move on to the next one, because we've obviously alluded to it quite a bit. So the next one is phonics, right? So now you've done all this great work with phonemic awareness. Your child's really great at the sounds. And again, I agree with Anna. I think spending some significant amount of time on the sounds and getting really fluent with that. And that's something, you know, that you can work on in the car, you know, on a walk or something. Like, oh, look, there's a maple tree. Like, how many syllables are in the word maple? Just a little bit builds up their confidence. And then you get into the phonics piece. So this is talking about the relationship between those sounds, those phonemes, as we call them, and then your letters, which are your grapheme or your symbols that go with each. I think most people are pretty familiar with that. Different curricula, I guess, will introduce it in different ways. I'm not sure how All About Reading did it, but Pinwheels was very much like, we're going to work on the short vowel sounds first. And they have these really cute, I'm talking about Pinwheels a lot, but again, I do. So they have these little cards, and there's a really cute like song / poem or something that goes with each, but it's tied to the shape of your mouth that it makes. So it's like apple, and it goes from like most open to most closed, I guess, if that makes sense. So it's like apple. Or no, I guess it's icky first. Sorry, excuse me. It's icky. Edge. Apple, umbrella, and then otter, and there's like this piece, and they have little pictures that go with it, but they just worked on the vowels first. And I think sometimes I get a little on my high horse when I see other, just sort of generic phonics, and they're like, okay, let's start with A, and what does A say? And it's like, okay, well, A can say or it can say A, and then they confused, or and it's now they're confused, or they start. I don't know. I think starting with the short vowel sounds is really powerful, because those are sort of your building blocks. Every letter, every word needs a vowel. So starting with those, I don't know if All About Reading, did they start with vowels?
So I'm trying to remember, because I started that in the first level. Explode the Code does. So there's actually an additional curriculum that I had pulled from my years of teaching, but it's called the Lively Letters, which is really fun. And have you heard of that one?
I think we've talked about it.
Yeah, each letter has a poem that goes with it, and it's really short, it's really fun, but it says the letter a lot, and at the end they make the sound, and I can't think of one of the poems right now, to recite, but it's a really great way to utilize that sound. So I do know, like for the one with umbrella, like there's a cute poem, but they go like like that. So every time that you hear that sound, you make that kind of motion, that sound,
right?
And but it's really, really helpful. I'm definitely, I feel similar. I get really snobby when I look at like alphabet books or alphabet like posters or something, and I see normally
for X-ray.
Oh my gosh. Or when I'm normally not, like, normally the consonants don't bother me, but it's like the vowels when you get like they'll put I like it when the picture reflects the short vowel sound, not the long vowel sound, or the worst is when it goes back and forth. Like it shows an apple for A, which is great, but then it shows like an eagle for E, and I'm like, because it just gets very confusing.
Or like ant.
Oh yeah. I hate ant. I hate ant. A-N and A-N. Yeah.
Like that's so far down.
I know. And people look at me like I'm crazy when they're not teachers, and I'm like, I'm so gung-ho about this. They're like, that seems really, I'm like, no, it's such a pet peeve. I get there's like a handful of alphabet books that I like and would recommend, and then other ones I go through and I'm like, no, that's so confusing. And ant is, I can't stand ant. But yeah, so it's important that however you're teaching the word, the sound, that you have a word to, you connect it with that really is that sound, and starting with the short sounds for vowels, going through the consonants and making their sounds, and linking it somehow right to either a poem or something musical or something fun and engaging so they can remember that letter. Practicing, I do a fun thing with my my little one Owen with the sounds, because we're currently going through all the letters right now, and then when we do the vowel, we do the short sound. He knows they make more than one sound, but the one that we're learning right now is just the short sound. But we'll go around and I'll hide things around the house that all start with the letter L. So he'll find his a toy lion over here, and he'll find a leaf over here, and he's connected. He gathers all of them, and then we go through that kind of thing. Something fun, hands-on, really gets them thinking about that letter itself. And then once they go through understanding what the letters are, they really have the consonants pretty solid with what the sound is. And the short vowels, hopefully, they have a good foundation, and you start to segment the word. You start to decode the words by sounding them out. So you're starting to put letter tiles, is what All About Reading use. But you start to put a consonant with a vowel, and you start to kind of sound blend them, start decoding the longer words. We could stick with that cat example from earlier, but now you actually are putting the C-A-T. Can we make that sound? Can we blend the C, the k, at together to make cat, and you read it? And there's lots of great techniques of, like touching and then blending. I've seen, I have used sometimes with, struggling readers, even more hands-on things like Play-Doh balls that you push and then you smear. Like, I mean, there's lots of different, not every kid needs that level.
Tap it out, like, and then they slide.
And slide it down,
to kind of get that motion of, like, you have to put it all together.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to do that. But now you're starting to get into that. And this is where you might start seeing, because a lot of kids tend to go pretty, through the letters, okay, the sound's pretty okay. This is sometimes for a lot of people their very first like resistance with kids, where they're sort of like, they doesn't necessarily, they may not get it right away. And so there's like, oh, I don't know if I like this because it's harder. So for some people, this is where they're going to hit their first level of a little bit of like, this is a challenge. Right. It may not just come to you like that. We have to spend some time, with it. But like word tiles, magnet type things, putting letters together, changing one letter. So, you've got cat, change out the first letter, the first sound, change it to a different one, or the ending sound. You start really, and then even getting them to play around with what is the beginning sound of the word. So now they're looking at reading the word from, left to right, and they're starting to, always start on the same side, and the beginning sound versus the ending sound. And they've already been playing with sounds, but now they're really connecting it to the words with the letters.
Right. And I think that's why it's so important to do all of that back end work on the phonemic awareness, right? Because now you're not hung up on like, okay, well, how many sounds does it make? And they don't know because they didn't have that exposure. Right. But if you've done all this work with like cat and bat and hat, and it's like, okay, what sound is changing? Where are we changing? Oh, we're changing that first sound. All right, swap that out, and then, okay, what are we replacing it with? At. And then now, which letter says, I gotta go find my H. The other thing I'll say too, we were talking just very explicit instruction with your phonics is going to be something that I would definitely recommend. A little bit of practice each day with it. And then the other thing is just be aware, as we talked about with the alphabet books, just be aware of how letters are being introduced. We use the example of cat. We also know that there's a hard C and a soft C, right? So sometimes C says celery. Right. So just be careful, and kids will ask, right? Like as you're reading, they might ask like, well, wait a minute, that says celery, that doesn't have an S. Or you might see it in their spelling that they start to just really stick to, and that's totally fine. That is completely age appropriate, normal. We haven't even covered soft C yet with my kiddos, and they're in second grade, and it's just, nope, we've worked on C says K and K says K. They're sound siblings, or sound cousins. I can't remember which one, but it's just, and then you talk about that some letters sound very similar, like and like M and N sound very similar. And again, that's where all of your phonemic awareness is really going to come into play, because you've done, like, let's listen really carefully. At what sound? Okay, which one says and pulling it out, stretching it, all of that kind of stuff. We could go on and on and on. But yeah, that's the phonics piece, tying all of the work that you've done with phonemic awareness to the letters, and being, most curriculums, I do feel like will be pretty thoughtful if you're using, a packaged curriculum. Just having that awareness that the general public and some published books may not be developed by somebody that has this knowledge. So being a little more thoughtful about maybe the things that you pick. And if kids have questions, you can always just be like, oh, well, we haven't talked about that more yet. We'll get to it.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, don't shy away from, if they're asking questions, there's no reason you can't say it to them. If not, and I do know the approach that I have used with kids sometimes, when I've had struggling readers that I've worked one-on-one with in a tutoring session or whatnot, sometimes having not a poster size, but a bigger piece of paper kind of split up into the letters. And then under each letter, you start to kind of organize how many sounds does that letter make? Because, you go back to it while you're reading and you're practicing. So that's not a bad tool to have in your toolbox, where you've sort of got a graph of all the letters and you go through and because you add to it. So once they do learn soft and hard C, now they can add that into their thing. And it's kind of a way to keep track, not only of what you've covered, but also of all the things, all the sounds that there are. If they're struggling with something, you pull that chart out again and say, oh, see, but it also makes this sound. And, so it's another thing. But phonics is long. In my opinion, phonics tends to get cut off too early. I do know that by third grade, normally phonics instruction is not happening anymore. generally, and even in second grade, sometimes it's really kind of quick. I mean, because there is such a push for reading, which we get into in other episodes about the push for reading happening so early now in many schools. But I think these two things, phonemic awareness and phonics, gosh, the more time you spend on them, it's like with math, you can't spend enough time on place value. It's like these are the building blocks. That's why I say like pillars, like these are so important, the foundations of reading instruction, and that if you do these, even if you feel like you're doing them to death, like it is so important for them to spend time on these two beginning pillars. So
yes, for sure.
Phonemic awareness and phonics. So we'll move on to number 3, which is fluency. And fluency, what it means is reading smoothly, accurately, and with expression. And fluency definitely looks different for kids. I mean, there are kids that take a lot longer than others to read fluently, and that's okay. There's a lot. But normally when you see fluency start to take effect is really kind of that bridge between decoding and comprehension. They're no longer having to decode each word. They're now actually reading and making some comprehension connections to it because they're not so focused on decoding each word. They've got it now at this point. So now the word recognition is automatic. Sometimes there's rhythm in it or phrasing. They're pausing at the sentences. When there's a period, they're using the expression of, if there's an exclamation mark and they're reading with excitement, or it's a question, so they're like, oh, and she said that. And, they're starting to really put in that kind of emphasis on, the actual reading that they're doing. And so fluency takes a lot of practice for some people and not as much practice for others, but I wouldn't rush fluency, but something with it is just repeated practice. You have to be reading, and we also get into that more in future episodes, but repeated reading, echo reading, read alouds, partner reading. I have these fun phoneme phones. They're just little like PCP pipes that they like to read into, and they could hear themselves like echoed in their ear, but that's really fun for them. And where they're, stopping. Sometimes people do little things like make highlighter marks on the periods of sentences so that they're, recognizing that you take a breath here and there, but they're really, it's really a bridge. Once they start reading more fluent, you can tell that those are now words that they aren't decoding anymore. There's a lot of automatic recognition happening at this point. So, and it can be really fun for readers when they start to feel like they're reading, smoother and more fluently. But it does take practice. There is that round robin reading that happens in schools, which is it's still probably the norm, even though everybody knows it's not the best practice. It's not round robin reading is basically where, everybody's reading a book and the teacher's going around and having kids read a paragraph, and for a lot of kids, this is very anxiety provoking. They often aren't listening to the paragraph before because they're just pre-reading their own paragraph because they're just so nervous about what they're doing.
Mistakes,
and comprehension is not taking place.
Right.
So if your goal for that is just fluency because you want them to read out loud, I guess that's fine. But if you're hoping to get some conversation going from round robin reading, that often doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I used to like to have my readers like pre-read something with a buddy in the room, and then if we were ever going to read it together, they would have already had a chance to read it once. And so does it take more time? Yes. But is it more effective? And do you have better conversations? Yes. Because the second time that you're accessing it as a whole group, they're not as nervous because they've already read it. And so they're coming with a different sense of confidence into the dynamic of reading it together. So
the one that I like too, and I think sometimes people would maybe shy away from is the repeated readings, or kind of like the echo readings where you read the sentence, right? And then they read the same exact sentence, and maybe you're touching each word, Tim has a hat. And then they do. Now it's your turn. Okay. Tim has. It's exposure. They already know it. You've set them up for success. They're building confidence, which I know is, another episode we're going to do in this series, but it really boosts their confidence. If it's an exclamation point, maybe you read it that way, and that's the part that you're emphasizing, right? It's okay to do activities like that to build fluency, automaticity. So I think one of the things that comes up that I like to encourage a lot to build fluency is what you were saying about echo reading or repeated readings, where the parent reads the sentence or the teacher reads the sentence, Tim has a hat. And then they do the same thing. Tim has a hat. It is really big and it's got an exclamation point. And so they're practicing the fluency and reading with expression. The pressure's a little bit off of maybe having to decode it exactly by themselves. They've got some support with that, which is really nice. And you build that confidence because, to build a fluent reader, they have to be pretty confident. like Anna said, repeated practice is going to be the biggest way that kids are going to get fluent. And it's okay if they have a book that they like, they can read it over and over and over again. Some parents will be like, but they just want to read the same book over and over again. Okay. And that's okay. That's okay. That builds confidence. And then maybe you do some repeated readings or some echo readings with a new book, and then they learn that one, right? And if they are memorizing the words, then that's okay too, right? It's building that confidence to be able to sit with a book and access text and meaning from text.
Yeah. And even if they're pulling a book to reread that, you think is too low for them or something, like I know with my son Leo, he often pulls kind of books he read last year, but those are what, so he's moved on, he can read much tougher stuff now, but those are sometimes the ones he wants to go back to and practice reading in front of the dog. And, and that's fine. I mean, that because any practice like that is still great. That's what he's choosing. He feels very confident reading those books. And so the fact that that's what he wants to read in front of the dog for practice, then that's okay. It's not like we aren't still reading other ones, but he's, it's that practice. I also just, before we move on from fluency, there's, when you were talking about kind of that echo reading, another style that I really like too, and they do this in All About Reading, is I think it's called like tree reading, but it's sort of like where you've got a sentence that gets along. So it might start with like, it's written like almost like a Christmas tree, but it's sort of like, it starts with like Tim sat down, and then the next line is Tim sat down on a log, and then the last was like Tim sat down on a log and ate a sandwich or whatever like that is. But so they're rereading the same part, over and over until they get to the final part where it's the full sentence. But by the time they get to that part, they've already, pre-read. So there's a lot of confidence going into reading the last sentence because they've been doing it. And I know for my first son that he used to love doing those. Like, had a lot of confidence by the time he got to the bottom of it, reading the big long sentence because he had gotten to the parts. And then another fun one too is like if you just take any kind of generic sentence, then they have to read it like 3 different ways. So it's sort of like we're going pumpkin picking. That'd be with a period, and then like we're going pumpkin picking, that's the next point, or it's like we're going pumpkin picking. That's with a question, right? They get to like have your kid make a sentence and then try to read it 3 different ways, and you guess which way they're reading it. Anything like that, that kind of practice is really fun.
Super fun.
So that would be fluency.
The ultimate goal, right? So fluency is definitely a big ultimate goal of reading in general. And then the next part is vocabulary. So this is looking at knowing and understanding words in the text. And this is going to be another key piece along with fluency to your ultimate goal of comprehension, reading to learn. So children need a rich vocabulary to make sense of what they're reading. So ways to encourage understanding vocabulary is through read alouds, storytelling, reading different texts, going back and encouraging them to think about what the word might mean. So some questioning. I really like read alouds for vocabulary. I think that's a really powerful, because you're redoing all of the sort of heavy work in accessing the text for them. And now you're pulling out this word, and, they're listening to the story and maybe understand, oh, wow, this word, what do you think this could mean? Bellowing. And then you go back and you reread it and you talk about like, wow, how do you think that they're speaking here? If they're bellowing, maybe, it talks something about like how the other person is, further away or something. So how would they have to talk? Oh, they would have to, be loud, and unpacking that with some really nice questioning is a good way to do that. You can do some explicit instruction for vocabulary words, or just kind of keep like a running list if you're doing a unit study, which we've talked about in previous episodes. Maybe keeping a running list of different words that go along with your unit would be really nice. So I agree. I mean, teaching vocabulary with read alouds is probably my most favorite way to do it. I am definitely not a fan of having a separate standalone vocabulary book. I've never thought that was a good, and research, you can look it up. I mean, it'll show that is probably the least effective way to study vocabulary words. Kids memorize the spelling and definition for tests, and then they cannot recall it the next week because there's no connection to it. So my favorite way to teach vocabulary is either through read alouds. I know, so by
third, fourth grade level, if you're doing reading groups or things like that with your kids, and specifically pulling out words from the chapters. You can either read them together and then together generate your list of words from each chapter or each section of the book.
Yep.
But there's such a different context to it because they're connecting, if they're words that are within a story that they're now kind of immersed in. And so they're gonna get they're much more likely to retain what that word means because it's in the context of a story versus just a generic vocab book where there's the word, the definition, that is very, I had to teach that way for many years because that was a curriculum that the school I was at was using. And I used to fight tooth and nail with can I replace this? Can I do? And there were times that I was allowed to kind of do it slightly different if I was using a unit study and making my list that I was getting pre-approved. But generally speaking, it was this gung-ho, nope, we use this vocabulary thing. And I would say, you can see it's in one ear out the other, unfortunately, for most kids. And it's also, they also aren't often aligned with any kind of spelling rule. There's sort of a set of 10 words that they got to memorize for that week. And they're, if you're going to do it like that, at least do it with a set of words that go along with a spelling rule that you're trying to instill. Yeah. But it wasn't even that. And so I was it's just, but yet it is a way that spelling is taught in many, many schools. And I really don't know why, especially when research doesn't support it. Right. I really don't know why. But anyway, so vocabulary, there's endless chances to access, different words. Again, whether you write down lists of them to kind of remember them or you talk about them. And it's not always, kids don't have to write down the definition and make a sentence with that word all the time in order for them to retain it. It's much more effective if you talk about it.
What you were saying about kids generating their own list of vocabulary words as a homeschooler might be a little bit tricky, but you could have your learner as they're reading or something, maybe put a sticky note or highlight or just kind of try to remember a word that they didn't know the meaning of. Because as grown-ups, we think oh, well, this word they might trip up on, or this word. But kids, might already understand what that word means. They may have heard it somewhere else. And words that we think maybe they should know the definition of, they get tripped up on. And so just having them be a part of gathering and talking about what words are interesting to them or words that maybe they don't quite know the meaning of. My kids are notorious for that. They'll read a word and then I'm like, what do you think that means? I don't know. Yeah. All right, but you read it, so great. But
mine are kind of the opposite. That when you read, if he doesn't, or if I'm doing a read aloud, he's always like, wait, what does that mean? Wait, what is that? Oh, that's and it is always a good time too. I also love doing, it's never too early too. Even if you're reading picture books with kids, it's fun to stop and if they're like, oh, well, what does that mean? And you're like, well, if it's a word they can maybe decipher the meaning of looking at the picture, so-and-so was freezing. And wait, what do you mean she was freezing? Well, look at the picture. Does she look like she's feeling a certain way? Oh, is she cold? Cold is freezing, so they start to, they can make connections sometimes with picture books. And then it's also a great segue into talking about, context clues when you're talking, looking at the rest of the sentence, kind of like how you had said earlier about, reading around it, can you decipher what the meaning of the word is based off of what the sentence, is, or, and so, because if there are pictures, that's another, it's a great way to do it. And, there's something just so authentic about them generating, the list almost, themselves, because the words that you wouldn't think that they would, have questions about, they do. And then the words you would anticipate would be great vocab words are not. And, it's a much more kind of authentic way of doing it. I feel like there was something else I wanted to say about that, but I can't remember. One part about vocabulary that, obviously a rich vocabulary, it deepens their understanding of, what they're reading. And so having more access to words and language is always a plus. This topic comes up with reading a lot too, is what people call sight words. And
high frequency
words. I mean, there's probably leap words. There's so many different, but they're words that don't follow the rules. And they're normally words you just kind of have to memorize. You got to know the and why and, certain ones like that. And so, there is a big emphasis on sight word recognition in schools at the moment. I don't think there always was, but I do know now that, come kindergarten, that there is a massive list of sight words that kids are expected to know and by the end of kindergarten. And if they don't know them, then there's, tutoring that needs to take place or work that has to be done before first grade. Sight words, to me, I disagree with the way that sight word instruction is being taught at the moment. I like the older style of sight word, which is in the context of reading. So, the word the, you're going to see the in so many things you read, they're going to pick up on it. They don't need to do a separate little lesson on what the is. It's a sight word. So I tend to do sight words where I might know what they are, and I have lists of, I have note cards with them and things, but I tend to teach them in the context of what we're reading. When it comes up, sight words often are usually common words. I mean, there's a lot of sight words that are fairly common, like, and they're ones that they're going to see a lot. So, and kids are smart. I mean, they pick up on things, quickly. And so sometimes if you do too much or push too much with this like separate, we're going to do a sight word lesson. I don't know. To me, I feel like they often fall flat, and they're not really, kids don't really remember them much. But if you're doing a story and you're like, you highlight all the sight words in them, because it sticks more. They're seeing it in their reading. This is why I need to know what these words are, versus, having like a sight word wall, or I don't know, like teaching them very separately outside of stories. I mean, that's an approach, and that is the approach for most schools, private, public, whatever. That is the approach. Sight words are taught separate. I don't think, from my experience, I have taught it that way, and I've taught it in the context of stories that we're reading, language that we're using, sentences we're writing, whatever. I think kids respond better to that. I don't, and there's such a pressure for some reason on these darn sight words. Like, I know moms who have kids in school, and they're like, oh gosh, they got to know charts. Yeah, they got to know this number of sight words before they enter. I'm like, they need to what now? Like, that to me seems, and they just can't remember them. And we're always like, I'm showing them flashcards. They're not retaining, they're not remembering. I'm like, oh my god. So there are so many other ways to teach these sight word, leap words. What is your curriculum called them?
So ours is caution words and common words. And so I actually really, I agree 1,000% about sight words. I don't like, clearly the jury is still out on sight words, because you've got like the Dolch word list and the Fry word list, and you've got another random word list, and everybody kind of has their own opinions on what constitutes a sight word. I can't stand when you get like in a first grade sight word list the word together.
You're right.
What? Yeah. Like, I'm okay if you want to do, like is, the, you know what I mean? Pinwheels does it caution and common words, and it goes along with whatever the phonics piece that we're working on. So for example, we're right now talking about ER, our controlled vowels, and the one that we're working on is ER. And so coming up, the one of the words that we'll talk about is her. And so her is going to be a common word. It follows all of the rules, and that's the thing that we talk about, right? It follows the rules that we've learned. H says ER says so this is her. It's just a word, and we say like it's a common word because it comes up a lot. You're going to see it a lot, right? But then you have other words like we just did AR a little while ago. So ARE. Okay, well, we know AR says R, because that's what we've talked about, but we don't usually see an E tacked on the end. Like car doesn't have an E at the end, right? So why does this word? So it doesn't follow the rules, so it's a caution word. And that means that we have to kind of just sort of know it, but there's a scope and sequence to introducing it, and then if it's a caution word or a common word, then it comes up in their little reader that we do. So there's that text-based piece where they're accessing it, and nothing is rushed. Like when we did I was thinking about the word like when, like we did I don't know if we've done actually WH, but I could imagine that like WH again follows all the patterns. It's going to be a common word. It just comes up a lot. So I'm like wary of the sight words. I don't think just memorizing this big long list of random words is the best way to do it, because if you have kids that have struggles, coming from like a special ed standpoint, if you have kids that struggle with working memory or other memory issues or anxiety around, that's going to be really hard for them, right? They can't necessarily memorize all of those. So just being really careful. And they're everywhere, right? If you go to Dollar Tree, you get sight words, and that's where you find like together in first grade.
I mean, that could be an entirely other episode, but when you go out and you look at either like you're at like a drugstore and you're seeing like the shelves that have supposed workbooks for grade levels, or even like reader books that you see at the library that say like pre-reader, preschool, and they're filled with words like smash and sandwich and and you're like, whoa, there's no way, like they're not. And I've had parents that have gotten some thinking like, oh, this would be great because we're starting to homeschool and now I've got all these, and then they look at them and they're like, wait a minute, whoa, they haven't finished their letters yet, how are these? And I'm like, no, because they don't. This is where those companies make material that they put out there, and it's not based off of any, teacher or educator, input whatsoever.
Yeah.
It might have really big pictures and big fonts, and it's colorful and fun to look at, but please don't base your stuff off of that or think that your kid's behind. Because they are just not, they're not an accurate representation of where kids should be. That's why it's also very important to always look at, who the maker of the materials that you're using, because you want something that's based off of somebody who either was like a reading specialist, an educator, somebody in the field at least, that's developing the material that you're using. Yeah. So vocabulary.
All right, and then the big ultimate goal of reading is
comprehension. You want your kid to read so they can learn stuff, right? I mean, that's the main part. That's the main goal. So, comprehension, the best way that you talk with your kids about what they're reading. I mean, you just have discussions, but looking at specific types of things like predicting future events in a story. Can they visualize things, question, make connections, summarizing, inferences, inferring. That used to be a big unit I used to do. I remember in fourth grade making inferences about the text. But yeah, you're thinking aloud, you're having discussions, they're connecting stories to their lives, they're connecting stories to other stories, they're connecting stories to themselves, they're just making, they're talking about what they're learning, and they're clearly learning stuff from it. They're making more questions out of what they've read. I mean, they're just, they are no longer decoding, they're no longer struggling through the sentences. I mean, not that they won't ever come across something they need help with, but generally speaking, they're no longer reading to learn, they're no longer learning to read, they're reading to learn.
Right.
And that's a big shift, and that's also a really fun moment for a lot of, homeschooling parents and educators when that is the shift, and because now your reading work looks very different. Your reading program looks completely different. You're no longer teaching how to read. It's a whole different thing, and a really fun stage when they get to that comprehension level.
I think too, I'll just interject, and I know you've done some work too with some of your professional development stuff you're doing with teaching with Tails. But so it's interesting because we're talking about like phonemic awareness, right? So you don't need to do anything with letters for that, right? You do a lot of play and practice. Then you do your phonics. But like while you're doing your phonemic awareness and your phonics and building that fluency, you can work on vocabulary and comprehension. This should not be like, okay, they're just learning to decode, so we're just going to work on that. Comprehension will come later. No. Don't do that. Okay. Read aloud to your child, even if they're, a struggling reader and maybe they're a little bit older and you think like, picture books or whatever. No, really, really read aloud. And this is the part that you can loop in if you have a struggling reader or if you just have a beginning reader. This piece is so important. Talking about books. When we started, so Pinwheels, I've talked about it so much today, but I love Pinwheels. I think it's fantastic. But the piece that I felt like it was missing, especially up front, was this vocabulary and this comprehension piece. All of these skills, main idea, details, inferencing, summarizing, a plot arc, talking about the characters, the setting. We did all of that stuff through read alouds. So I would get a book, we would do one book a week, we would read it multiple times. So I'm modeling fluency, we're talking about vocabulary, and then we had a skill that we worked on, but it was all read aloud, right? There was no real strenuous work on the kids as far as you now have to sit and read this book and decode it and then tell me what it's about. So
it can be so natural. I mean, even like I'm thinking I was reading a Halloween book the other night to the kids, and it was one of those predictable books where there's a repeated language, and so they knew before I even turned the page, and the character says they're going to say boo, and so boo, that sure enough it was. And so there's repeated, but that is making some predictions even at like a preschool level. Like, I mean, they're predicting what's going to come next. Or even if you're reading a fun story and, I don't know, again, we have lots of Halloween books going on right now, considering it's almost Halloween here. But, there was this one that we were reading the other night where this witch is on a broom and she's picking up different creatures to take on her trick-or-treating journey. And so, before we turn the page, it was like, well, who's she going to come up to next? And so they were making predictions based off of the little hints in the story of what it looked like, where she was going. And then we turn the page and, she is picking up the skeleton, or she, whatever. But like all that's them making predictions, that's them, whatever. Or if they're getting a little bit older and you're doing, chapter books and you're starting to really kind of have more of a character development piece where they're learning more about the main character and their personality. And they're starting to think, well, how do you think she was going to respond to this? Maybe there's a cliffhanger ending to a chapter, before you read the next one, stop for a minute. Talk about it. How do you think she's going to respond to this incident that happened in chapter 4 before you read chapter 5? I mean, it really can be very authentic and genuine. You don't have to have a separate, comprehension sometimes can look
read this and tell me what it was about.
Right. Or it can be like this comprehension paragraph with 3 comprehension questions that really are, sometimes I have read things like that and been like, I have no idea what the answer is. I mean, it's like a 3rd grade level paragraph. I have read it and I've read the first question and I was like, I have no idea if it's A, B, C, or D. Like, what's wrong with me? I mean, it's like, there are some, like, they can be tricky. And that's also, to me, I mean, again, talk about killing the joy of reading.
Yes.
If you're doing, I'm not saying you don't want to bring in test taking elements at some point if you're planning for your kid to return to public school, or for, introducing that when they're older as just a skill to know how to take tests or whatever. But, or even throwing that in there here and there. But if that's your main, like, way of doing, reading comprehension, you might think your child's a whole lot lower than they are, because those worksheets and even those workbooks that have reading comprehension paragraphs and questions are, they're very surface level. They aren't often there because they're normally a multiple choice. So it's normally like, is the character happy, sad, angry, or tired? And it probably says somewhere in the paragraph, Jack's feeling happy today. Okay, well then they're just they're just copying information they found. Yeah. And again, there are times when being able to cite information is important, but generally speaking, you don't want to rely on that only being your comprehension. You want to have more conversations that are like about the story, just asking questions, and that could be an interesting thing, even if we put up kind of created, I mean, there are documents like this, but sort of a running list of, I have a really good one, so I can post it in the show notes, but of sort of questions to use for any book. And I think my mother actually ended up giving it to me once, but who was a former teacher. But, there are questions that literally could work for any book. So if you're starting this and you're like, I don't know what to ask my kid. I read with them, but I don't know what to ask, which I can imagine happens. I mean, to us, it doesn't seem like it's very natural, but, that's because of our background. So this could be a good list of questions to put out there. But comprehension does not need to look like, read this, answer these questions. That is not the only, if anything, that should be a teeny piece of it, practice with it, but not, and we do actually get a whole lot more into critical thinking and comprehension. Our last episode. So, we've covered our 5 pillars: phonemic awareness, phonics instruction, fluency, vocabulary, and the ultimate goal of comprehension in this first mini episode out of our 4. But we are going to be moving on. We have 3 episodes coming up. The next one being how to build confident readers without burnout, and that's for kids and parents. We go on to when to worry about reading delays and when not to, which is a really interesting topic, because there are a lot of parents that rush to think their child needs massive intervention, and they may or may not. And then also, if they do, how that looks like in the homeschooling arena. But then the last one, our 4th episode, is what reading comprehension and critical thinking look like and how to do it. So we'll get really into that in the last episode, and hopefully give you some good insight or information and ideas about how to bring that about even more in your instruction of your kids.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So until next time, keep the lessons light and the moments meaningful.
And thanks for escaping with us.